The dogs went quiet at 2:40 in the morning, and that was the first thing Walt Brunner noticed. Before the smell, before the sound, before any of it. He had 8 head of cattle and 2 stock dogs and 160 acres that ran up the backside of Copperhead Ridge. And those dogs barked at everything. They barked at the propane truck. They barked at thunder a county away. So, when Walt sat up in the dark and the night outside the window held no dog sound at all, he was awake the way a man is awake when something is wrong before he can name it. He lay still and listened. The clock on the dresser read 2:41 in red digits. The window over the bed was cracked 2 inches for air, the way he kept it from April through October. And through that 2 inches the night came in, flat and cold and empty. No cicadas. The whippoorwill that had worked the tree line every night that week had stopped. Even the creak, which a man stopped hearing after 20 years, the way he stopped hearing his own breathing, seemed to have pulled itself down into the rocks. Walt was 51 years old, and he had lived on that ridge his whole life, except for the 4 years the army sent him other places. He raised cattle and cut a little timber off the back, 40 when the price was right, and he fixed what broke because there was no one else to fix it. He did not spook. He did not invent things. When the men at the feed store in Birch Hollow told their stories, the ones that grew an inch in the telling every winter, Walt drank his coffee and said nothing. And they knew better than to ask him to weigh in, because Walt would only tell you what he saw, and most of what he saw was weather. His wife slept beside him. Carol had been a school nurse for 26 years before the district consolidated, and the bus routes got long enough that she retired rather than drive 90 minutes each way. She slept the way she always had, on her side, one hand under the pillow. In the second bedroom, down the short hall, their grandson slept, 4 months old, a small warm weight in a borrowed crib. His name was Eli, and his mother, their daughter Renee, had gone back to work the swing shift at the plastics plant in Mountain Grove, and brought the baby out to the ridge most nights because daycare cost more than the shift paid. The crib had been Renee's crib once. It still smelled faintly of the cedar chest. It had spent 20 years inside. Walt got up. He did not turn on a light. He had walked that house in the dark for 50 years. He went to the front window in the main room and stood to the side of it out of habit, more than reason, and looked out at the yard. The yard light on the pole by the barn threw a cone of sodium orange across the gravel. The 2 dogs were not in it. They were under the porch. He could see the shine of one eye where Duke had pressed himself back into the dark against the foundation block, low to the ground, not making a sound. Walt had never in 9 years seen that dog go under the porch for anything but the 4th of July. He stood there a long time. The cattle were down in the lower pen, a dark mass against the fence, and they were not bedded the way they should have been at that hour. They were standing. All of them. Facing the same way, up the slope, toward the black wall of timber where the ridge climbed away from the house. Walt had worked cattle long enough to read a herd the way other men read a face. And what the herd was telling him was that something stood up there in the trees, and the cattle had decided it was worse than the fence, and worse than the dark, and worse than each other. He watched the tree line until his eyes ached. Nothing moved. The smell reached him then, faint through the cracked front window, a wet animal musk, with something under it that did not belong to any animal he knew. A sourness like a wet dog left too long in a closed truck, but heavier and older. He had skinned coon and dressed deer and pulled a drowned calf out of the creek in August. He knew animal smell. This was animal, and it was not. And the part of his mind that had kept him alive on ice and under falling timber for 50 years told him to step back from the window, and he did. Nothing happened. the rest of that night. He sat in the kitchen chair with the .30, -30 across his knees, not because he had a target, but because the weight of it was a kind of company, and at some point the cicadas came back one at a time, testing, and then the whippoorwill Dot. And by the time the gray came up over the eastern field, the dogs had crept back out from under the porch and stood blinking in the yard like they were ashamed. Walt put the rifle away before Carol woke. He did not tell her. There was nothing to tell that would not sound like one of the feed store stories, and he was not a feed store man. He told himself it was a black bear. There were bears in that country, not many, but they came through drifting down out of the forest land to the south in the dry years when the acorn crop failed, and a bear would move cattle and quiet dogs and leave a smell. He had run a bear off the corn crib 2 summers back, a sow with a yearling cub, and he had seen the scat and the raked open feed sack and the muddy paw marks on the crib boards, and the dogs had treed the cub and barked themselves hoarse, and there had been nothing in any of it that pulled a man out of his sleep with a cold spot behind his breastbone. He told himself bear, because bear was a thing a man could buy a permit for, and a thing a man could understand. He believed it for most of a day. He fed the cattle and ran the chainsaw on a wind-thrown oak down by the creek and ate the dinner. Carol sat in front of him and answered her questions about the price of feeder calves and the believing held the way a patch holds on a tube until you put real pressure on it. It came apart that evening when he walked the upper fence line to check the wire and found where the thing had stood. The ground at the top of the slope was soft from the week's rain. The grass there was knee-high and lay in 2 directions where something heavy had moved through, and in the bare mud at the edge of the timber there was a track. Walt crouched over it with the long evening light coming in sideways, which was the only light that showed a track true, and he looked at it for a long time without touching it. It was not a bear. He had seen bear track his whole life, the broad front pad, with the 5 short toes set in an even arc, and the claw points close to the toes. The hind track that looked almost like a flat human foot if you did not know to look closer, and this was not either of those. It was longer than his own boot, and it was not a paw spread flat. It showed 4 toes, and the toes ended in points that had pushed down into the mud past where a claw would push, deep and narrow, the way a thing pushes when it is bearing real weight forward onto the front of the foot. And behind the toes the print was not round like a pad, but long, the way a heel is long. The way a man's heel is long when he goes up on the ball of his foot to lift something heavy. He set his own boot beside it for scale, without stepping on it, easing it down in the soft mud the way he would set a level on a beam, and the track ran half again past his toe, near to 17 inches from the back of the heel. He took the carpenter pencil from his shirt pocket and laid it across the width at the widest part, and the track was wider than the pencil by a thumb on either side, and the pencil was... He sat back on his heels and let his breath out slow. A bear's hind track was big, but it was not this, and it did not push down into the front of the toes like this, and it did not sink 3/4 of an inch into firm pasture mud the way a thing sinks when it weighs what a large man weighs and is balanced on the front of 2 feet, instead of spread across 4. There was 1 track, and then 4 feet of nothing, and then the next, and Walt knelt there in the wet grass and measured the gap with the pencil end over end, and came up with a stride, near to 5 feet, and a 5-foot stride meant the thing had not been walking. It had been moving easy, the way Walt moved across his own kitchen. And nothing that moved on. 4 feet left astride. Like that he did not finish the fence. He walked back down to the house, with the light going out of the sky behind him, and he did not once turn his back fully to the ridge. And he hated that he did that. hated that some animal part of him had already decided to keep the high ground in view, because the rational part of him still had no name for what he had measured and was not ready to give it one. That night, he brought both dogs inside, which he had never done, and Carol looked at him over the supper dishes and said, "You want to tell me what's got into you?" And it was not a question. It was the opening of one, the way she opened every hard conversation. 26 years of pulling the truth out of people who did not want to give it. "Bear's been through," Walt said. "Don't want the dogs tangling with it." Carol dried a plate and looked at him, and set the plate in the rack. "You've had dogs tangle with a bear before," she said. "You never brought them in the house." "This one's big," Walt said, and it was not a lie exactly. And they both heard the part of it that was not the whole truth land on the kitchen floor between them and lie there. Carol did not pick it up. She had been married to him 30 years, and she knew the shape of him when he was holding something back to protect her. And she let it go for that night and went down the hall to check on the baby. The second night it came closer. Walt had not slept. He sat in the front room with the lamp off and the rifle near and the dogs at his feet, and at 1:14 in the morning by the clock on the stove, he could see through the kitchen doorway. The dogs both lifted their heads at once. Not the door. The wall. The wall of the room where the baby slept. Quote, Walt was up and down the hall before he had decided to move, and he stood in the dark of the second bedroom with his hand on the crib rail, and the baby breathing slow and untroubled below him, and through the wall, through the cracked window of that room which he had not thought to close, he heard it. It was a sound he would spend the rest of his life failing to describe to anyone who had not heard it. It started low, below where sound usually started. A rumble he felt in the floorboards through his socks before he heard it in his ears, and over that bottom rumble rode a second sound, higher and broken, a kind of chattering vibration, as if two separate throats were working in one chest and neither one of them was meant for a throat that size. It was not a growl the way a dog growls. It was not a bear. It went on longer than a breath should go on, and then it stopped, and the stopping was worse than the sound, because the stopping meant the thing had decided it was done, making it Walt did not move. He stood with his hand on the rail, and his body between the crib and the window, and he looked at the gray square of the window screen, and he waited. The smell was in the room now, that wet, sour heaviness coming through the screen, and he understood that the thing was close to the wall, close enough that its breath was coming through the window into the room where his grandson slept, and the cold that went through Walt then was not fear the way he had known fear. Fear was loud. This was silent, and it was total, and it emptied his mind of everything except the 4 feet between the window and the crib. Then it was gone. He did not hear it leave. The smell thinned, and the floor went still, and after a while the cicadas started up again. Outside one and then another, the way they always came back, indifferent, and Walt stood in that dark room until his legs cramped and his hand had gone numb on the crib rail. Then he carried the crib, baby and all, down the hall to his own bedroom and set it against the inside wall, the one with no window, moving slow, so the wheels would not wake the child, and Carol woke at the sound and sat up and saw his face in the gray light from the hall, and she did not ask him anything. She looked at him, and she looked at the crib against the inner wall, and she lay back down with her eyes open, and that was how she knew it was real, because in 30 years she had never once seen him afraid, and he was afraid now, and he was not bothering to hide it. In the morning he found the marks. They were on the siding under the baby's window, 4 parallel grooves cut down through the paint and into the wood, and they started higher than Walt could reach. With his arms stretched full over his head, He stood under them and reached up, and the bottom of the highest groove was past his fingertips by a foot, and Walt was 6'1". He got the tape from the truck and measured in the top groove, started at 9 feet and 4 inches off the ground. He stood there with the tape hanging from his hand and did the arithmetic he did not want to do. 9 feet, 4 to the top of the reach. The thing had stood on its hind legs flat against the wall of his house and put a hand, because that was the only word that fit, a hand against the wood above his grandson's window and dragged it down. The grooves were evenly spaced, the width of a splayed hand, and at the bottom of each one, the wood was pushed up in a curl, where the point had dug in and pulled free. He stood in the kitchen with the phone and Carol watching him, and he told the dispatcher he had an animal coming up on his house at night, a big one, and he had tracks and marks on his siding, and he would like someone to come out and look. The dispatcher was polite. She took his name and his road, and she said she would have a deputy come by when one was free, and she asked if the animal was on his property right now, and Walt said, no, it came at night, and the dispatcher's voice changed by a degree, the way a voice changes when it moves a thing down the list, and she said they would get to him. No one came that day. Walt had not expected anyone to. Not really. He drove into Birch Hollow in the afternoon and bought 4 flood lamps and 300 feet of outdoor wire and a roll of hardware cloth and a box of 2-inch deck screws, and the man at the counter, Dale Pruitt, who was about Walt's age, and had known him 40 years and had stood up at Walt's wedding, looked at the order spread on the counter and said, "Coon getting in your feed?" And Walt said something like that. Dale rang it up and made change and looked at him a second longer than the transaction needed. "You all right out there, Walt?" he said. And it was Carol's kind of question, the kind that was the opening of one, and Walt said he was fine, just tired of losing sleep to varmints. And Dale nodded slow, and Walt carried the boxes out to the truck and drove home, and spent the rest of the light running wire. He set the flood lamps at the 4 corners of the house and ran the wire under the eaves, and down to a junction he wired to a switch. He mounted on the wall by his bed so he could throw the whole yard into daylight from where he lay without crossing the floor. He tested it twice in the falling dark, the yard jumping white, and then black, and then white again, and the dogs flinched both times. He cut the hardware cloth with tin snips and screwed it over the baby's window from the outside, over the screen, sinking the deck screws deep into the frame, not because cloth would stop a thing that had cut 9 feet of paint off his wall, but because doing it was better than not doing it. Because a man does the thing in front of him when the thing he wants to do has no shape and no name and no answer. He worked until full dark with the headlamp on his brow and the moths coming to it, and then he went inside and locked a door that had never needed locking in 50 years and sat down in the kitchen chair to wait. The third night the dogs would not settle. They paced. Duke stood in the middle of the front room with his hackles up and a low sound in his chest that he could not seem to stop, and the other dog, the young one, pressed herself into the corner by the wood stove and shook. Carol had stopped pretending to sleep. She sat at the kitchen table in her robe with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her and the baby in a bassinet at her feet, and she watched her husband watch the windows, and neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, which was that it was coming back and that nothing they had done would matter when it did. It came at 2:53. The dogs knew first. Duke stopped his pacing and went rigid, and pointed his whole body at the front of the house, and Walt threw the switch. 4 flood lamps slammed the dark back to the tree line, and for 1/2 of 1 second, caught at the edge of the light where the gravel gave way to grass, Walt saw it. He would tell it the same way every time he told it, which was almost never. And only to Carol, and only once to Renee, and he told it flat. The way he told everything, because the flatness was the only way he could carry it. It stood at the edge of the light on two legs. It was tall, taller than the top of the truck cab, and it was covered in dark matted hair that the flood lamps did not make brown or gray but left black, and its shoulders were wrong, too high and too forward, and its arms were too long and ended in hands that hung past where a knee should be. The head was long. That was the part he could not put down. The head was long and low between the shoulders, and it was the head of a dog, and it was not. And the eyes caught the floodlight and threw it back the way no animal eye throws light. A flat amber shine, steady, not startled. It was not afraid of the light. It had only stopped to look at him. And then it turned, not fast, not fleeing, and it went up the slope in 3 strides that ate the ground and was into the timber and gone. And the place where it had stood held only the bent grass and the smell coming down on the night air. Walt did not chase it. He was not a fool, and he was past the place where a man tells himself stories about what he would do. He stood in his lit yard with the rifle in his hands that he had not raised, because raising it would have meant deciding to use it, and he had understood in that half-second of amber eye-shine that using it might not be enough and might be the worst thing he could do. And that understanding was the coldest thing he had ever carried. He went back inside. Carol was standing in the kitchen with the baby against her shoulder, and her face was white and still, and she said, "I saw it," because she had come to the window behind him, and Walt had not known she was there. "Through the glass, I saw it, Walt." "Walt?" And he held them both, his wife and his daughter's son, in the white light of his own kitchen. And there was nothing to say, and so he said nothing. And outside the dogs began very slowly to come back across the yard toward the porch. The deputy came the next afternoon. He was young and decent, and he had a notebook and a flat-brimmed hat he took off when Carol offered him coffee, and his name was Officer Tilly, and he could not have been more than 26. He wrote things in the notebook, and he walked the yard with Walt, and he crouched over the track at the top of the slope, the one Walt had covered with a feed bucket against the rain, and Walt watched him look at it, and watched him not let himself see it, watched him reach, instead, for the explanation that let him close the notebook and get back in the truck. He looked at the grooves on the siding under the empty window, and he stood under them and reached up the way Walt had reached up, and could not touch the top one either. And Walt saw something move behind the young man's face, some small, honest flicker of a thing that did not add up, and then he watched him put it away. "Bears could stand taller than people thought," Tilly said. "A big boar marking territory could rake a wall higher than you'd believe, and the track was probably a hind print on top of a front print, which made it look longer than it was." He said it the way a man says a thing. He has decided to believe because the other thing is too big to carry in a county vehicle on a Tuesday. He gave Walt a number for the conservation department and a line about a nuisance permit, and he put his hat back on and got in his truck and drove down the gravel, and he was gone before the dust had settled back onto the road. Walt called the number. He left a message on a machine that named a woman Sharon and a department and a list of options. 2 days later, Sharon called back and explained the process for a depredation permit in a kind, tired voice, the voice of a person who fielded these calls all season, and she asked Walt to document the damage with photographs and dates, and to keep any physical evidence, scat or hair, in a sealed bag for an officer to collect when one was in the area. Walt took the photographs, the grooves, the track, the bent grass, holding a tape measure in the frame the way she said to, and he printed them at the drugstore in Mountain Grove, and he put them in an envelope with the dates written on the back, and the officer never came, and Sharon never called again. And that was the whole of the help that came to the ridge from the outside world. He understood, after that he was on his own with it, the way men in that country had always been on their own, with the things that came out of the timber, and that whatever this was, it had been there before the county had a number to call, and it would be there long after. It kept coming, not every night. That was the part that wore on him worse than nightly would have the not knowing, the way it would let 2 nights pass, 3, until Walt would start to believe it had moved on. And then on the 4th night the dogs would go under the porch, and the cattle would face the slope, and the smell would come down off the ridge. He learned its pattern, the way he learned weather, by watching. By writing the nights down on the kitchen calendar in pencil, so small Carol pretended not to see it, and the pattern that emerged was the worst thing the evidence told him. Worse than the track, and worse than the grooves, and worse than the eyeshine. It was learning the house. The first night it had come up the open slope to the front. The second night it had gone around to the back to the baby's window. The third week it was coming to whichever room they had moved the crib into, and they had moved it 3 times, and each time, within 2 nights, the thing found the new window. He had moved it first to his and Carol's room against the windowless wall, and for 2 nights the thing had gone to the empty room where the crib used to be, scratched the siding under that window, found it wrong, found it empty. The third night, it came to the wall behind the room where the crib was. Quote, Walt had moved it again to the small interior pantry off the kitchen with no window at all, and the thing had circled the whole house that night, slow, and Walt had tracked its progress by the dogs turning their heads, by the smell moving wall to wall, by a single grooved scratch low on the back door where it had tested the one way into the house's center. And then it had gone away, and 2 nights later it had come back to the kitchen wall nearest the pantry, the closest outside wall to where the child slept. As if it had stood out there in the dark and done the same arithmetic. It did not test the windows where Walt and Carol slept when the crib was not in their room. It went to the wall behind the child every time, and Walt could not make the evidence say anything other than what it said, which was that the thing knew there was a small one in the house, and that it had decided the small one. He wrote the nights down on the kitchen calendar in pencil so small that Carol pretended not to see it. A tick in the corner of each square where it came, the time beside the tick. And when he stood back and looked at a month of those marks, he saw a pattern that was not random, and was not hunger, and was not anything an animal did. And he stopped looking at the calendar after that, but he did not stop making the marks. He stopped sleeping in any real way. He learned to take it in pieces, an hour in the chair with the dogs as alarm, then up to walk the inside of the house, then an hour more. Carol took Eli into Mountain Grove, and stayed 2 nights with Renee in her apartment in town, and Walt sat alone on the ridge those 2 nights, and the thing did not come, not once, and that told him the last thing he needed to know. It came for the child. When the child was gone, it had no reason, and so it waited, somewhere up in the timber where the ridge ran back into the national forest, and a man could walk 3 days and not cross a road, and it waited for the child to come back. He thought about leaving. He sat with it the way he sat with every hard thing, turning it over, and the trouble was that the land was the only thing he had, 160 acres free and clear, that his father had worked and his father's father, and the cattle were on it, and the timber was on it. And a man does not walk away from his ground because something he cannot name has come down out of the trees. But the child was not the land. The child was his daughter's son, and Walt had carried him in the crook of one arm while he did the dishes, and the calculus that any other man would have called simple was simple for Walt too, in the end, and it cost him more than he ever told anyone. The last night was a Thursday in late September. Renee had driven out to pick the baby up for good because Walt had told her, on the phone, in the flat voice, more of the truth than he had told anyone, enough that she had stopped arguing and gone quiet, and she had come to take Eli home to town where the streetlights stood close together and the houses shared walls. She was loading the car in the last of the daylight, the diaper bag over one shoulder and the baby carrier in her hand, and Walt was carrying the folded crib out to the back of her hatchback, and the light was going purple over the eastern field, and the dogs, who had been easy all day, came up off the porch at once. It was not full dark. That was the thing Walt could not get past. After. It had never come in the light before, and the light was not gone. There was still color in the west, and the yard light had not yet flicked on, and the thing came down out of the timber at the top of the slope,